wish I could hold it. Hi. Can you all hear me by sitting all the way over there? Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, you know, I don't look much like a child, I know. I'm 77. In fact, I'm 77 today. Thank you. And, you know, not many people can have such nice public birthdays. I just had one over at the middle school. You know, it was great. I mean, it's a good way to celebrate, much better than cake. Anyhow, the reason that I speak is because there's not many of us left alive. I'm one of the few last remaining people who were alive during that era. Most of the people who were in concentration camps are dead now, or they would be in the late 80s, early 90s if they are alive, and they probably wouldn't be able to talk anymore. I also found that a lot of the people who were actually in the camps couldn't speak about it. They didn't want to talk about it. I met many people, and it took a long time for people to talk. I'm the next generation, and I'm able to vocalize what they were not able to. And, you know, the more I speak, the more I realize how important it is to do this, because there's such a lot of hatred in the world today, and I'm so frightened of certain things that are happening that I feel that if I can voice what happened to me, it might be almost like a deterrent to some people. I come from Transylvania. Transylvania, you know, the vampire people? Anyway, that is part of Romania now. It was part of Hungary when all this went down. And it's an area, it's very much a tribal area, like lots of places in the middle of Europe. You know, there's no such pure country as, for instance, Holland. And they were Romanians and Hungarians living in this town. And it was a very prosperous little town. Everybody was well off, and when people are well off, they don't hate each other as much. And it was a town a bit smaller than Troy, for instance. And it had, you know, it had a theater and several theaters. It had an opera house, concert halls. And it was quite a nice, cultured life before it all went away. And I am the child of a Jewish father and a Catholic mother, which in itself was very unusual because people didn't intermarry. It just wasn't done, you know. Both families were appalled. And I remember being told that my mother converted to Judaism if only to please my father's very large Jewish family. But they were not very, very religious because, you know, they were secular. And I remember my mother went through the motions of doing the candle lighting on Friday nights and, you know, putting a scarf over her head and muttering things. And as a small child, I used to think she's trying to do magic. I didn't know exactly what she was doing. And I had an absolutely wonderful childhood. My parents were 30 and 40 when I was born, and I was their only child, and they were both quite well off. My mother had a dressmaking business because in those days there were no ready-made clothes. You bought a piece of cloth and you went to a dressmaker to have it made into a dress. And she had 40 workers working for her, so she had quite a big business, doing very well. And my father had a fish wholesaler business. There was a river going through the town, and he had these great big crates in the river with fish in it. And they were carp, you know, with their long whiskers. They looked like old peasants, I thought. And there was always one in our bath because for some reason we ate a lot of fish, obviously. And I remember as a child feeling very sorry because I knew this was going to be a fish that would be lunch. And so I would go in and talk to the fish and apologize and say, look, I'm so sorry, but you're going to taste so good and we're going to appreciate eating you. And, you know, I felt better after that. And I had everything as a child. I had the most beautiful bedroom with silk walls with little flowers on it, and I had a bed like a princess, and I had a big wall full of toys, you know, on shelves. I had absolutely everything that any child could have. I was spoiled rotten, to tell you the truth, but it was absolutely wonderful because I was very loved, and I truly believed that I was the center of the universe. And I was definitely the center of my daddy's universe. He was very much, you know, my main person in my life. He was the center of everything for me. He was big and strong and happy, and he would protect me from everything, and he was wonderful. And unlike in those days when children were just told what to do, he would explain things to me. He always explained why I had to do things or why he was saying something. And he was very, very kind. He was always helping people. He was a good person, you know. And my mother was also very good, but my father was my main parent. And they didn't want to deprive me of Christmas, you know, because all the children were having fun, and so I always had a Christmas tree too. You can't imagine the size of it. I mean, we had high ceilings. It went all the way up to the ceiling, and it had little candles on it, and they would light the little candles, and there was always 2 buckets of water next to it because it always caught fire. It was a normal Christmas fire. And under the tree, there was every conceivable present for a spoiled little girl. And you know, it was unbelievably pleasant. And then one day, one of the maids decided to take me to the local church to show me the nativity scene. And I stole baby Jesus. Stuck him under my coat. I came home, and my mother found it. And she says, "Oh my God, they're going to say the Jews are stealing Jesus." Off I went back to the church. And this very tall, skinny priest was waving his finger at me, telling me I was going to hell because I stole Jesus. I was petrified. I never wanted to set foot in the place again. I was terrified. And of course, I never stole Jesus again. But, you know, every time I go past the nativity scene, I still kind of think, should I? Should I? Just for the hell of it. Anyway, so at this point, my parents, in their well-meaning sort of ignorance, decided that they had an out-of-control 4.5-year-old, and it's time to get a governess. Well, they got a governess. Boy, did I get a governess. She was from Austria. She spoke German, and she was tall with a bun on her head, and she had a mouth like a slash. She never smiled. I called her Fräulein, which is Miss in German. And I hate to say it, but Fräulein was a bitch. She really was. She was terrible. She was terrible. You know, I wasn't allowed to leave the table until I finished absolutely every crumb on that plate. I was never allowed to do anything. I wasn't allowed to have water until I finished my meal in case it took away my appetite. I had to sit, believe it or not, with a ruler behind my back, which was tied with a string around my neck and around my waist to make sure I sat straight. And she put hard-boiled eggs under my arms so that I would keep my elbows close to me. I still do that when I sit. I do it properly. But Fräulein was awful. But on the other hand, in a mere 6 months, she managed to teach me to speak, read, and write German, which was no mean feat for a small child like that. And she used to read me the most terrible stories, the Grimm brothers, you know, about children being eaten, about children being burnt, about children having their fingers cut off because the nails are too long. Something called Struwwelpeter. If any of you ever have that book, don't read it to your children. I think it should be banned. But every time I complained to my parents about Fräulein, they said, no, Fräulein knows best because good girls from good families have to be brought up in a certain way, and this way you're going to be a well-brought-up young lady, and all right. But on the other hand, you know, when I went for a walk with her, she wouldn't let me speak to the children in the street. She wouldn't let me play with the children in the street because they weren't rich enough or something. And I was only allowed to play with one little boy, a very cute little blonde kid with big curls and big blue eyes. And because his parents were rich, I was allowed to play with him. And I remember admiring them terribly because they had a bust made of his head, and it was on their mantelpiece, and I thought this was the most glamorous thing in the world. I mean, my goodness, he's immortalized. And he and I used to run outside the opera house on the round sort of driveway, and the game was that if I caught him, I kissed him. I learned to run really fast. I kissed him a lot, and he hated it. And he would wipe his little face, poor little thing. He was killed too, by the way. He never came back. But I remember big Jewish family gatherings. They used to put together like, I don't know how many tables, because there were 28 members of this family. And they all came, and you know, family dynamics. This one isn't talking to that one, and that one is angry with the other one, and there's a lot of noise and a lot of gossip, and it was wonderful. I had cousins and aunts and uncles, and it was great, and everybody made a fuss of me, and I was the center of the universe, and we had these great big dinners, 28 people, all gone. I'm the only one who's alive in that whole family. And at this point, they also decided to give me a bit of my Jewish heritage, and they sent me to a Jewish kindergarten 2 mornings a week. And the only nice thing about it is my little friend was there too. But there were 52 children in this kindergarten, and there's only 2 of us who survived. And I'll tell you later, I met the other person who survived. I met her like 50 years later, which was amazing. Anyhow, you know, the Holocaust, when we talk about it, is probably the best documented genocide in the world, although there's lots of other genocides. I don't know, have any of you heard of the Armenian genocide, which happened at the turn of the century? The Turks killed 1.5 million Armenians. And to this day, they don't admit it. They don't admit that this happened. I mean, terrible things happen all over. Genocide is going on today in Syria, in Africa, everywhere. And one of the reasons that I speak is that because, you know, when you look at statistics, you can't really understand it. You have to be one person. You have to talk to a human being who was there or who suffered to understand what it can do to a person, because statistics don't bleed. People bleed. Statistics don't. And I remember how it all started, and they didn't just suddenly decide to kill the Jews. It was a slow progression. And of course, Jews have been persecuted for very many years, because way back when they first started spreading out across the world, they were persecuted because they were supposed to have killed Jesus themselves. And they were persecuted because they were different, and they had a different religion, and they didn't mingle, and they didn't mix, and they didn't convert. They kind of stayed together, and that was very suspicious. And you know, there were times in the Middle Ages where Jews were accused of killing Christian children and using their blood to bake matzahs. You know, matzah is without blood or without fat, so it doesn't make sense. But you know, that kind of persecution happened throughout the ages. And Jews weren't allowed to own property. They weren't allowed to be in the professions. They weren't allowed to be lawyers and doctors at first. It only happened sort of in the late 1800s that they could do that. And in our town, it started by, first of all, everybody had to register with the police. So they knew where everybody lived, each house, how many people in it. So they knew where we were, and they said they needed us to register to protect us. So everybody registered. And then kids weren't allowed to go to college anymore. And then they weren't allowed to go to high school anymore. And then the elementary schools threw them out, that you could only go to a Jewish school. And then Jewish doctors weren't allowed to treat Christians. And anybody who employed people under the age of 45 had to let them go. No women under the age of 45 were allowed to work for a Jew. And slowly but surely everything got, you know, eroded. And every time this happened, people thought, oh, well, you know, this shall pass. I mean, come on, we've had problems before. Nobody imagined where it would lead. You know, nobody said, well, we have to stop it now. It didn't occur to anyone. And, you know, with all these new laws, I mean, I remember as a kid, I wasn't allowed to go to the swimming pool anymore because I was Jewish, and I wasn't allowed to sit on my favorite bench in the park because that was not reserved for Jews. There was a Jew bench. I had to sit on the Jew bench. And people started disappearing because all these people who weren't allowed to be employed by Jews had to go somewhere else. And, you know, there were whispers, and it was a very uneasy situation. Even as a child, I remember everybody was sort of looking around, looking behind them, and being quiet. Every time I came in the room, they stopped talking, and I'd say, what's wrong? Why aren't you telling me? Oh, nothing, nothing, nothing. But thank God Fräulein was gone, and that was wonderful. I didn't wash my hands for 3 days. It was great, because she was a cleanliness fanatic, that woman. I mean, you know, even today, every time I don't wash my hands, I rebel. And, you know, I wasn't allowed to eat on the street. That was the biggest sin. You do not eat on the street if you're a girl from a good family. So the minute I'm out of here, I am going to eat in the street. You know, I still rebel. And it's great to be able to rebel at my age. But I'm still doing it because she was mean. And anyhow, then my mother came to see me and she says, I have a present for you. And she brought me this yellow star, you know, Star of David, beautiful shiny material, and she sewed it on my blue coat. And I was so proud of this star. You know, little girls love shiny things, and I was very proud, you know. And she says, let's go and get some pastries. And we're walking down the street, I'm holding her hand, and a man comes opposite and stops and looks at me. And I look up at him, expecting him to say something nice about my star. And he spits in my face, and the spit runs down my face onto my star. And I don't understand, I'm horrified. Why does he hate stars? Never occurring to me that it's me he hates. And I look up at my mother, who always protected me, and I said, you know, say something. And the man, shh. She drags me home, and she says to me, I couldn't say anything. And I said, why? She says, because you don't understand. It's not the star he hates. It's you he hates because you're a Jew. Okay, so it's me he hates. Fine. But I still didn't understand that it had anything to do with danger, because I didn't understand that. And then the Hungarians decided to have a ghetto. Now, you know, the word ghetto is an Italian word, and it means foundry, a metal foundry, which was in Middle Ages Venice. It's still there. It's called Vecchio Ghetto. And that's where the Jews had to live in Venice. That's the only place they were allowed to be. During the night, they had to stay there. They weren't allowed to roam around, but during the day they were out. And they also had yellow hats, and I was wondering if the yellow had anything to do with that. But anyway, that's the word ghetto, which unfortunately has terrible connotations now. And the Hungarians built a big wall around a small area of pretty poor houses, and all the Jews had to be interned there. And it happened very suddenly because they had everybody on the list. So they came, and I remember looking from the window, and they were pushing people with guns and whips, and they were putting them on trucks and on carts and marching them, and suddenly everybody was gone, and all their animals were left because they were taken so quickly that they didn't have time to give their animals away or to take care of them. And there were all these poor hungry animals running around, and I remember as a kid being very upset about that, because you identify with animals. And then the dog catcher came, and all the animals were gone, and it was quiet. And I remember my father leaving for the ghetto. They were standing next to a tall table like this, holding each other, my mother and my father. He had a little suitcase next to him, and they were sobbing, and I wormed my way between them. And they were crying, so I was crying, and I wasn't worried because my daddy was always, you know, very dependable. I mean, he's my daddy, he's going to come back and look after me. I treated it almost like a business trip, you know, Daddy's going away for a while. But my mother was very upset all the time, and I couldn't understand that. And then my mother decided not to let me go to the ghetto. I was supposed to go because even if you had one Jewish grandparent, you were supposed to go. Well, I was half Jewish, so I was absolutely supposed to go. And my mother said, no, she's going to stay home here, and I'll hide her. And I was under a bed, and I wasn't allowed out. I couldn't go near the window. I wasn't allowed to go outside. I was pretty miserable, and I didn't understand why I had to hide like this. And then one day a woman came to see my mother. She used to bring our milk. Milk used to be brought to your house by a peasant with a cart and a horse with a big vat, and then you'd go downstairs, and then they would measure the milk and you'd pay for it, and that's how milk was delivered. And she had been delivering our milk for many years, and when she got married, because she had been an orphan, my mother made her a beautiful wedding dress, and she never forgot it. And when she heard about the Jews being rounded up, she knew my mother had married a Jew. She came to see her, and she says, give me the kid, I'll hide her. And my mother said, are you sure that's safe? And she says, of course it's safe. Yeah, out in the country, who's going to know? And so my mother came and got me, and she gave me a little suitcase, and I put my doll in it, and I hopped up on this carriage, and this nice woman let me hold the reins of the horse. And here we go, and we went to her house in the country. And I remember there was the hillside, there was her house, and then on the left of that was a small barn with two stalls, one for a horse and one for a cow. And to my surprise, she makes me get out and takes me to the barn. And I said, well, why aren't we going to your house? She says, no, you don't understand. They're going to kill you if they find you, so you can't go to the house. You have to stay in the barn. Okay, I didn't know what it actually meant. I've never stayed in a barn. So she took me upstairs to this tiny little attic area. And there was a lot of hay there because they used to throw the hay up. There was no bales, but they would throw it up there for the horse and the cow. And she left me there, and I remember my first night, I was terrified. I cried the whole night because I was afraid. It was getting dark. I'd never been alone, and there were big black spiders everywhere. I was terrified. But, you know, slowly you get used to it. And eventually it became my life. You know, there was nothing else I could do. I was there several months, and I even made friends with one of the spiders. I caught a big spider and I tied a string on his leg, and he was my pet. But then the leg came off. And then I felt very bad. I crippled the poor spider. But you know, that's how I spent my days, playing with bits of straw and the spider. And at night she would sometimes take me to her house to give me a bath, and she would bring me food. And she was very good to me, but you know, I was alone. And she told me, listen, if anybody comes anywhere near, you don't exist. You hide under the hay, you make yourself tiny, you don't breathe, you don't yell, you don't do anything because people want to kill you. And this whole idea of people wanting to kill me was very strange to me, because think about your own death even now. We can't understand it. Now, a 5-year-old doesn't really understand death very well, you know. But I knew that I had to hide. And one morning, very early, there's a commotion, and there's 3 soldiers in green uniforms with black feathers in their hat and guns with bayonets, and they're slapping her around, saying, where's the Jew bastard? Where's the Jew bastard? And she says, there's no Jew here. Go look in the house. And they all go and they ransack her house. Obviously, I wasn't there. And they're ready to leave. And one of them has the bright idea to look in the barn. And I heard this, and I hid immediately under the eaves, pulled the hay over me, and I remember the steps coming up the stairs, these big boots going clonk, 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 coming up the steps. And then they started poking the hay with their bayonets. They were going to look through the whole hay to make sure there was nobody hiding. And I really made myself very small, and my heart was beating so hard that I was afraid they would hear it, because it was almost jumping out of me. And I was terrified. I really was terrified. And then they came closer and closer, poking the bayonets. and one of them landed near my face, about an inch from my face, and it got stuck in the wood. And he pulled it out, and it made a sort of twang. And I think I realized then what it means to die. Dying to me meant that somebody's going to stick a knife in your head. And it was very scary. And thereafter, I never complained about being hidden because I knew that I had to be. I was really scared. And I have a cheat sheet so that I stay on track. They arrested my mother because they found out with a list in the ghetto that I wasn't there. And they took her in and they tortured her, and she never told me what they did to her. She said it was far too humiliating. And then she went and got my father, bribed somebody with some gold coins she had to get my father out of the ghetto. And he was going to walk across the border into Romania. The border was near us. And he said, well, before I go, I'm not going to see the child for possibly a number of years until the war is over. I'm going to go and visit her. I don't want her to think that I'm just disappearing. You know, she depends on me and I love her and I have to go and see her. So I'm going to visit her at night very quickly before I leave. And there was no way that she could dissuade him. So he took his bag on his back and he walked at night to the village where I was. And they caught him on the road and they deported him the next day to Auschwitz. And he never came back. And you know, I feel guilty about it sometimes because if he hadn't loved me so much, maybe he wouldn't have been caught. I don't know. I mean, you know, it wasn't my fault. But on the other hand, why would you sacrifice your life for a child? You know, I don't know. It's things that you think about all your life and you don't resolve it. And then my mother came to get me and she says, wonderful news, the war has broken out. Now that was great news because the Russians were coming and they're going to be nice to us and they're not going to kill us and they're going to liberate us from the Nazis and how wonderful it's all going to be. Well, that wasn't exactly how it went down, but anyway, she took me home. And I remember saying goodbye to the woman who hid me. Her name was Erzsébet, which is Elizabeth in Hungarian. And I remember she cried so hard as I left. And we went home and the bombs were falling. And every time the bomb started up, we went down to the cellar. And after a while, we stopped going to the cellar because the bombs were coming all day long and there was big explosions everywhere. And the biggest problem was we had nothing to eat. There was only a few potatoes in the basement, and that's what we ate. And when the fighting stopped, some people would run out and find some mushrooms, but half of those were poisonous, so we were afraid of eating those. And I remember looking out from the window, because at some point we stopped going to the shelter because there was so much going on. And I was looking out the window, and there was a cart pulling somebody's pathetic belongings. And the poor horse died in front of our house. I mean, he just couldn't move anymore. He was old and skinny, and he just collapsed. And the man was kicking it and trying to get it up, and the horse was very dead. So he unhitched the cart and took it, and then the horse was left there. And within minutes, doors opened, and people ran outside with dishes and with knives. And they started peeling back the skin of this horse, and it was cold. I remember the steam rising out of the horse. And they cut little bits of the horse. Everybody had little bits of meat. They all ran home and cooked it. And that's what we ate. And you know, I wouldn't eat a horse now if you paid me. I love horses. I had 2 horses. And 2 of them just died of old age at my house. But you know, when you're hungry, you'll eat anything. I mean, it was actually very good with the potatoes. The horse and the potatoes was quite a nice meal for a change. And then at this point, we were watching the war. It was happening across the river. The Russians were crossing the river. It was frozen. And they were linking arms and marching across the river, singing, always singing. They were constantly singing. They must have been drunk because I don't believe that you can get people to march into machine gun fire singing otherwise. And they came in waves. And as they came up the embankment, they were shot down. And then another row came up, and then another row until they were building up really high. You couldn't even see the river anymore. And the last lot that came over weren't shot anymore. These people, I don't know, they gave up or they left, but they left and we were under Russian occupation. Well, that didn't exactly go as we expected either, because they were a bit wild and a bit vindictive, and they were beating up people and stealing things and molesting the women big time. So my mother built a false wall in our bathroom, and all the women from the house and the area were hiding in there because they were terrified of getting raped and murdered and whatever. The Russians, though, didn't mind children, and I remember one of them gave me an apple in the street, and I thought this was the best thing ever. They liked children, but, you know, they didn't like anybody else. And at this point, my mother, who was always very efficient and very resourceful, decided to take matters into her hand, and she made herself look like an old woman. She blackened her teeth, put some chalk in her hair, put a scarf on, an old grey dress, a pillow under the dress on her back, an old cane, and she pretended to be a trembling old lady, and she went to see the commander of the town, the Russian commander. And to her surprise, the commander was a young woman. By this time, the Russians lost so many people that they were promoting younger people, like young women and young men, to these jobs. They had nobody else. And this woman, I don't know how old she was, but to me, she looked young. And my mother said to her, listen, I'm a dressmaker. Come to my house and I will make her nice dresses and you look very pretty. And this girl, who obviously never had anything nice in her life, came over, and my mother they took one of the drapes off and made her a dress. And this woman was so happy that she brought some other Russian soldier girls, and suddenly we had food. We had chickens, and we had butter and eggs, and even a piece of chocolate. And all the women were feasting in the little hidey hole, but they still couldn't go out. And at this point, my mother asked the commander if we could have a guard, because, you know, we were afraid. And she sent us a guard. His name was Ivan. He was a young captain, no more than 17, and he had a sidekick, an old Russian gentleman who used to play the accordion. And both Ivan and him were drunk all the time. They could drink like you wouldn't believe. They drank my mother's cologne, they drank meth, they drank everything. And when they would find a bottle with alcohol in it, they would bite the top off and just drink it. They wouldn't even bother to open it, even if they had blood all over it, they would just drink. But they were very happy. They were singing all the time. They were drunk and singing. And one day, Ivan brought my mother a goose liver, which is a big delicacy in Hungary, and it still had a bit of blood on it. And Ivan, never having had plumbing in his home, didn't know, and he wanted to wash it, to give it to my mother. And he put it in the toilet and pulled a chain, and the liver went away. And Ivan shot the toilet. He was so angry. And then, when it was cold, they would burn our antique furniture, you know, in the fire. It was fine. And they would take pot shots at the moldings and the ceiling. But, I liked them very much. They were very nice to me. He taught me how to do Russian dances. And he told me he was going to come back and marry me when I was 17. And then, one day I was ill, and he brought me an orange. I had never seen an orange before. It wasn't like now that you could buy every fruit. You ate what grew during that season or in your country. And I remember he brought me this round, beautiful thing, and I opened the paper, and it looks like the rising sun and the odor of that orange. And then I had little bits of it because I was sick, and then my mother candied the rest of it. And I wasn't allowed to eat it unless I was sick, and I wanted to be sick all the time to eat orange. And to this day, I love oranges. It was such a big deal to get an orange when you had been starving. It was amazing. And then I don't know how, but Ivan and his sidekick disappeared. I think the Russian soldiers were put into some sort of a camp somewhere. They used to march up and down singing, but they were no longer molesting people in town, and things quieted down. And at this point, my mother came to see me, and she says, listen, I think Daddy is going to come home tonight. There's a train coming in from the Polish area, and there's some survivors on it, so we're going to go and meet the train. And she got all dressed up, and she dressed me up and did my hair, and I kept thinking, will he recognize me now that I'm such a big girl? And I was so excited. And we went to the railway station, and we stood there, and people came off the train, and they came off the train, and we stood there, and I have a picture here. We used to hold up a picture to see if anybody had seen him. And we walked around with a picture, and nobody had seen him. And then some of these poor people came off the train, and they looked like shuffling ghosts. They were in gray rags, and they had no hair, and they had sores, and that you couldn't tell if they were men or women. They were like ghosts, and they were smelly and scary. And my mother kept going up to each one of them with a picture, asking, have you seen this man? Have you seen this man? And nobody had seen him. And I remember going home, we were crying all the way home, holding hands, crying. And she says, well, he'll probably come tomorrow. And this went on for about a week. The next day we went, the same thing, we hold up the picture, and Daddy isn't there. And my mother starts taking these poor people home because they have nowhere to go. So she brings them to our house, and she washes them, and she delouses them, and she treats their wounds, and she gives them clothes, her clothes if they're women, and my father's clothes if they were men. And they sit and they talk and they talk and they talk, and I'm not allowed to listen. I hide behind the sofa, of course. Of course I listened. And the horror stories that these poor people were telling, I mean, it was just horrendous. It was horrendous. One of the girls had a tattoo on her chest, and she asked my mother if she could make her a dress that would cover it. It said Feldhure, which means field whore. What they did, they took pretty young girls and they tattooed this on their chest, and they sent them out to the front so the soldiers could enjoy them. And when they were worn out, they shot them. And this girl escaped with some partisans in the woods. And her biggest problem was to cover this up because she was so ashamed. This is just one of them, and I'm not going to go into the... Did I do that? Okay. And what happened is that, after a while, the stories got worse and worse, and I didn't want to listen, but I did want to listen because I wanted to know. And I'm sure you've heard enough about what they did to people in camps. I don't have to go into detail. And one of the days when we're at the train station, a man comes up to my mother and says to her, don't wait for him, he's not coming back. And she says, what do you mean not coming back? Was he ill? I'll tell you later. Well, he never told her. He told me, but he never told her. And she didn't recognize this man. It had been a friend of the family. My parents used to go to his hotel casino to play cards every Sunday. And this poor man, he was also a musician, by the way, and when the commander found out, they broke all his fingers and they never set it again. He was a violinist, and he ended up with hands like that because they never set it and he could never play the violin again, just for fun. And when he arrived at Auschwitz, he was deported with his wife and daughter. He had a little girl, 11, her name was Dita, which is short for Judith. This is her picture. And this little girl was taken to Auschwitz with her parents, and she and her mother were sent automatically to the gas chambers. And the father was sent to the other side to work. And when he asked one of the guards, where are they taking them? And he pointed to this chimney, says, there. And he didn't understand at that time. But they were gassed that same day. And this poor man, he was all broken. He came home to us, and he came with my mother, and she gave him some clothes. And he said, well, I have a lot of my stuff we left with our local housekeeper. She's been with the family for many years. And he knocked on her door, and she opens the door wearing his wife's dress and looks him up and down and says, so they didn't kill all of you? Well, anyway, the Russians took everything. She slams the door in his face, and he's standing there with nothing. And the poor man sort of came back to us, and somehow out of two broken families, we cobbled together a family. And he became my stepfather. But the problem was that I always felt guilty about this little girl, because although I didn't know her, I actually had her life. I had her dad, I had the life that she should have had, and I always speak about her because once I'm gone, nobody will ever remember her. And one of the schools where I spoke, it was actually in 8th grade, they decided to do a school project, and they made these photographs with her description and her life on the back, and they sent it to 500 middle schools all over the States. And I still get letters from middle schools way in different places saying, we're not forgetting Dita. They have a Remember Dita thing in the library, which I'm very happy about. And one of the colleges is going to have a little statue made of her. I want to celebrate this child whom I didn't know, because when I'm gone, nobody will know she existed. You see, the problem is that not only did they kill people, but they wiped out their existence to the point that nobody knows where they are, they're not buried anywhere, they don't know their names, they've gone. And when I was a little bit older, my stepfather told me how my father died. He had stolen a piece of bread, him and another person from our town, and they were caught. They were hungry, so they stole a piece of bread. And they wanted to make an example of them, so they stripped them naked. This was a spring in Poland, very cold, and beat them half to death and put each of them in a dog kennel. And they put the dog kennels in this big field where they would have the prisoners come out every day to be counted. You know, they would count the prisoners as a deterrent and as an example to what happens to people who steal bread. And it took my father 2 days and a night to die. And this has made me incredibly bitter as a child, because I was so full of hatred. I just wanted to kill the people who did this. You know, I was fantasizing about killing them slowly, flaying them alive, burning them. It was pretty awful. And at this point, my stepfather brought his old mother from Romania to live with us. She was a very religious Jewish lady. And my mother brought her mother, the Catholic grandmother, and these two women battled for my soul. I was dragged to church on Sunday. I was dragged to synagogue on Saturday. Hated the synagogue because I had to sit upstairs. I wasn't allowed to participate. And the church smelled better. But I was terrified because there was a priest at the church, and you know what they do to little children with a finger. And I had so much religion that I thought I could never handle any of it anymore. And I know that the hatred that I felt in my heart was something that was very corrosive. And even as a child, I was ashamed of the horrible things I kept thinking, or the killing I wanted to do. And so it took me 50 years to get over hatred. And some people helped me. I've met some wonderful people. There was an old man who once cheered me up. I was in school in Romania by this time. It changed to Romania. And I was being beaten by the Romanian kids because I was Hungarian, and the Hungarian kids because I spoke Romanian. And they all beat me because I was Jewish, and I was a smart aleck, and I knew everything, so everybody hated me. And I had 2 braids, and I remember they cut off one of my braids, and I remember walking home. I was about 8 with my braid in my hand, and this old man stopped, and he looked at me, and he says, "Little girl, don't let them make you a victim. If you become a victim, if you feel sorry for yourself, they won. You'll survive and your hair will grow. Go home and be happy. Cut the other one off as well. It will grow." Things like that really, really helped me, because I realized that, yes, of course, I'm not going to give in. And you know, one of the things that really bothers me is all the extinguished potential. How many artists, how many scientists, how many teachers, how many painters, how many musicians, how many writers, how many creative, wonderful people would have come out of these people who were killed? Not necessarily them, maybe their children, you know. And, you know, I have four sons, and every time I gave birth to a Jewish child, it was giving the finger to Hitler. And it felt very good. It felt wonderful. And to this day, you know, I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor. And I always tell children when they're bullied, don't let them make you into a victim. You can survive. You can survive most things. I mean, unless they actually kill you, you can survive. And I'm a very happy person, you know. I have a very multicultural family. I have 4 sons, as I said, and I have 4 granddaughters. One is half Chinese, one is half Mexican, one is half African American, and I have one who's half German. One of my sons married a wonderful young woman whose father was a German soldier. And she was kind of apprehensive coming to see me, saying, how are you going to feel about this? I said, oh, no, you don't understand. We don't visit the sins of the father on the children. And she is very dear to me. And when they had this little daughter, and I held her in my arms, I remember the tears just coming down like rain, thinking, wow, this is a granddaughter of a victim and a perpetrator, and this is how we have to go forward. This is what needs to happen. It's not a question of forgiving. I don't have the right to forgive your death, but I have the right to stop hating. I don't hate anymore. I have sorrow, but no hatred. And I find that if your soul is full of hatred, there's no room for anything else. So I filled it with love, and I go around and I speak to people like you, and every time I speak to people and I get a lot of love back, it's such a healing thing. I feel I'm so happy. I'm a very happy person. And you know, unfortunately, there were people who spoke up. There was a wonderful German pastor, Niemöller, you might have heard about him. He said, first they came for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't one of them. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up for me. And the point I'm making is that each and every one of us has the power to change the world. You all feel that, oh, well, I'm only one person. I'm not going to bother to vote when I can vote because I can't. Yes, you can change something. That one single peasant woman, not only did she save my life, but she saved my children and my grandchildren's life. We each have the power of one, and don't give up that power, and don't let people scapegoat people. You know, the first scapegoating happened all about the illegal immigrants, okay? So the illegal immigrants, not one of them was guilty of getting the banks to go broke, which almost broke this country. All the banks were sent south by wonderful, white, old, nasty, greedy men. It wasn't the poor African or any kind of immigrant. And also, you know, they talk about immigrants. How many of you here are Native American? Can I have a show of hands? Oh, we have one. Oh, good. 2. Well, that's not bad. 3. You guys can stay. All the others are illegal because you don't know if your grandfather had a permit to come here or your great-grandfather. So this whole idea about immigration is crazy. This idea that we are Americans. Yes, we are Americans because we are one people now. We are an amalgamation of all the people. But the only pure Americans are the Native Americans whom we killed. And also, the other thing that they all preach now is, oh yes, it's the Muslims. Oh, they're dangerous, they all hate us and they're going to kill us. Well, first of all, if you do your research, more Americans have been murdered by local white American terrorists than any Muslims, A. B, there's millions of Muslims, millions of different Muslims, and you cannot blame everything on one religion. Just like if say, Jehovah's Witness kills you, you're not going to persecute all the Jehovah's Witnesses. Each person has their own personal quest or their own personal vendetta. And, you know, they put people in boxes. People ask me sometimes, how come you consider yourself Jewish? You're half Catholic and you're half Jewish. Why are you Jewish? Why is Obama black? Same thing. He's as white as he's black, but he's our first African-American president because we perceive him as a black man. I was perceived as a Jew. I'm Jewish by perception and persecution, not necessarily by conviction. So I'm in the Jew box. He's in the black box. You know, they put people in boxes, and that's one of the things that I think your generation won't do because you're much more informed than even the generation before you. Because I think it's the internet, and as much as your parents might hate it, don't give it up. Because I think it opens people's minds, because you're all aware of what goes on in the world. And I have high, high hopes for your future. And you have to make sure that your future stays good and that you don't allow hatred and prejudice to take over, because that could ruin this country. And you know, I speak for the dead because they can't speak for themselves. And I have this theory that 10% of people are truly, truly good, and 10% are pretty evil, and 80% are sheep. And the sheep scare me, because the sheep are so easily led. I mean, you know, I also found as a child that it was easier to follow the bully than the good person, because all you have to do to be bad is to laugh when somebody gets persecuted or beaten or whatever. To be good, you actually have to say something, you have to do something. And one little act of kindness a day can change your world. It's your world. I'm 77, I'm out of here. But you guys have a long life ahead of you, and you will have children, hopefully. And whatever you do with your world today is going to impact not only you, but your children, and possibly your children's children. And this is a wonderful country. I came here on purpose. I'm not an illegal immigrant, and I'm not a refugee. I came from London, where I was doing very well, but I wanted my children to grow up here because of the space and the freedom. It's easier here. We are not as crowded as they are in Europe. And I think the average American is a very decent person. There isn't that much hatred. People are trying to make you hate, but it's not going to work. I really, truly believe in the goodness of this country. Because, you know, when you put too many rats in a box, they eat each other. I'm not saying there's no rats in America, but the boxes are bigger, so we have more room. We don't eat each other quite as bad. And, you know, they unfortunately, every time I open the television, I get very frightened, because they opened Pandora's box of hate speech. It has become legitimate to call people names that you weren't allowed to do in middle school. You were told off if you called somebody names on the playground. Now we have politicians calling each other names and body parts and God knows what else. It's terrible. Don't let it happen to you. Don't let the world take it itself away from you. Save this wonderful country, because it's yours to do. You each have the power of one. Thank you very much. I just want to say something. As you can see, I don't really have any filters, so if you would like to ask me questions, go for it. I can answer anything you like.
Can I just ask, if you ask a question, can you stand up and project your voice so everybody can hear it? Can you make that?
My, what a silent group you are. Wow. There we go. Yes, sir. No. As a matter of fact, all I saw, I only know the stories, and I also saw, obviously, the newsreels, like all of you must have seen. And you know, I haven't been to Auschwitz yet. I had my ticket. I was in Poland. I had my ticket for the train, and I chickened out. I didn't have the courage to go. But I think I will go, and I will take my little German granddaughter with me, because she's conflicted too, because of her past, you know. She says, well, what am I? Am I the child of a victim or a perpetrator? So she's now a teenager, and she has problems with it. So we'll go together. Any other questions? Yes?
What kind of institutionalized and governmental safeguards are in place in Germany and in other countries to prevent such an atrocity from occurring in the future? And what ones would you like to see?
Well, Germany, he's asking what kind of institutional safeguards are present in some countries, like in Germany, for this not to happen in the future. Germany is doing a very good job, actually, and I must say I have a lot of respect for the Germans because, first of all, they stood up and they say, yes, it did happen, unlike the Turks, who never admitted the Armenian genocide. They don't allow, by law, you cannot publish or put it online anything to do with hate against anybody, Jews or immigrants. They don't allow it. And it's going to be a problem because suddenly there's an influx of millions of people, the poor Syrians, who by and large are decent people, but they're in terrible straits, and suddenly there's like an invasion of people in your country, and you think, oh my God, we can't afford these people, so obviously they turn against them. But it's not on a hate basis, it's more on a basis of we can't afford this. Other countries, you know, unfortunately, I do believe in free speech, but I wish they wouldn't use it for hatred. I mean, somebody showed me a leaflet they sent to one of the colleges, some organization with swastikas and things, don't let the Jews take over, some Jewish conspiracy. Well, if there is a Jewish conspiracy, can I please have the address? I'd like to join. What Jewish conspiracy? You know, there's always somebody. You have to hate somebody. Scapegoating, they need it. You know, you walk down the street, you stub your toe. You don't think, I'm a clumsy idiot. You think, they didn't fix the road. It's the town. Somebody else. It's always somebody else. Anybody else? Yes. Can you holler?
You said that when you went to the Jewish kindergarten, only one other person you said.
Yes, I'll tell you about her. I was at a cocktail party in London. You see, I had a very long and involved life after, you know, because when you're 77, you've done a lot of things. And I was very much an overachiever all my life. I've had several careers, and I've been very successful as a fashion designer in London, and I was a journalist, and I did all kinds of things. But anyhow, I was at a cocktail party, a very elegant thing in London, and I hear a voice, and it sounds like me. You know, I've heard my voice recorded. And I go up to her, and I said, who are you? And we start talking, and it turns out that she is the other child. And we were in our early 50s, and we fell on each other, crying. all these posh English people were looking down their noses at us. You don't behave like that, you know. But it was wonderful. She was a doctor. Unfortunately, she died of cancer not long after I met her. But it was wonderful to know that somebody else made it. She was the only one I know of. Sorry, anybody else? Yes?
What point did you feel safe from danger?
When? You mean? I would say when I got rid of the hatred. Because, you know, hatred comes from fear. And danger breeds fear, so I felt afraid, and therefore I hated, because I thought they would come back and get me. And once I got rid of the hatred, I felt safe. I felt safe in Europe, but I didn't think that Europe would always be safe somehow. There's a lot of things going on. And where I come from, there's no more Jews, so now they're persecuting the gypsies. Big time. The Hungarians and the Romanians are pretty harsh on their gypsies. And they have nowhere else to go. Anybody else? Yes?
Your mother was Jewish, right?
No, my father was Jewish. My mother was
They
Catholic.
wouldn't arrest your mother based on...
No, because she had married a Jew. They persecuted her big time. They would write nasty things on her door, and she lost most of her business. People wouldn't come to her. She had a hard time, but she didn't get killed. They didn't kill the Catholics. They only killed somebody with Jewish blood. Anybody else? Yes?
Do you actually catch a spider and make it your pet, or is that just a joke?
No, it's not a joke. If you're a child and you're alone and the spiders, you eventually realize they're not going to eat you. They didn't bite. They were just big. and furry. I'll teach you how to do it. Anybody else? Back there, can you holler?
Do you ever feel like survivor's guilt for what happened, like being the only one that you and your family made it?
Yes, I do. I agree with you that survivor guilt is a terrible thing, and I still feel it. And one of the reasons that I became such a nasty little overachiever is because of the survivor guilt. I had to make my life count. And possibly it's the guilt that makes me talk now, because I was given a life. I'm here. I lived. And therefore I have to do something about it, because the others can't. They can't speak. There's no one. I agree with you. There is, everybody has survivor guilt. If you survive a car crash and you're the only one, you always think, why me? And I think, when I think about this little girl, Dita, she probably was a much better child than I was, probably much more talented, much nicer. Why me? Why not her, Anyone else?
The young man right here is waiting.
Young man, I can't see a young man waiting. Go ahead.
How many languages do you speak?
Sorry?
How many languages?
8. But one of them is not so good anymore. The Romanian is not so great anymore. You have to, when you come from where I come from, I mean, who speaks Hungarian, for God's sake? You have to learn other languages. But I still speak German, and I wouldn't speak German for many years because I was angry. And when I stopped being angry, I started speaking German again. I didn't want to pronounce those words. You can't blame a whole country. Yes, go ahead. Young lady with a ponytail.
Would you consider yourself one of the 10% of the
I would like to. I try to.
Can you repeat the question?
Would I consider myself one of the 10% of the good people? Well, I do go and I do agitate and I do talk. So I suppose I fall into that category. And I certainly would not allow anyone to be bullied. I mean, I'd kill. Slowly. But I have not had persecution in this country at all. I have not been persecuted as a Jew. I live in a small village in New Hampshire, and when we moved there 38 years ago, I thought to myself, I better make it very obvious who I am so that there's no misunderstandings. And I told a few people that, yes, I'm Jewish, and if I hear any anti-Semitic remarks, I will tear their heart out and eat it. Never had any problems. As a matter of fact, I have been elected to different offices in our town all the time. I mean, they accepted me. Maybe because I'm telling it as it is, they seem to like that, but at least I'm not evil. Anyhow, who else? Can you stand up, dear?
How old were you when you were first hit?
How old was I when?
When you were first hit?
Just under 5. Just under 5. Yes.
How many years were you in for?
3 months.
Oh, 3 months.
That's all. But that was long enough for a small child. I mean, imagine being in an attic with the spiders for 3 months. I mean, it's a long time. Yes.
As you mentioned before, you went to Catholic church and Jewish synagogue.
Mhm.
Do you still do so?
No. Unfortunately, I lost my faith. I envy anybody who has it. I lost my faith. The only faith I have is, I would like to call it love. I don't have any prejudice against any religion, but I do have a Christmas tree, so I suppose I'm a Christmas Jew. That's about the only thing I do. Yes.
You said that your mother converted to Judaism
Yes.
because it would please your father's family.
Mm-hmm.
Did she have to register as a Jew too?
No, conversion to Judaism was not, they didn't kill you for that. But on the other hand, if you converted to Catholicism as a Jew, they would still kill you. It was a double standard. It's a good question. No, she wasn't killed. She was just persecuted big time. I can't really see anybody because I'm in the light and you're in the dark. Can you stand up?
When you registered at the beginning, and did everyone register because they thought that it was
When they made us register, the Hungarian authorities told us that they're going to register us because they don't believe in persecuting the Jews in their country. And the Hungarian Jews were the last people to die. That they were not going to allow the Jews to be persecuted, so they wanted to protect us and let them know where we were. As it so happens, there was only 200 German Nazis who completely annihilated the Hungarian Jewish community of 500,000 people or thereabouts. Everything was done by collaborators. Happy, gleeful collaborators, like those soldiers with their feathers. I still hate black feathers. It's amazing how this sticks with you. But unfortunately, not enough people stood up. Not like the woman who saved me. Yes?
What are your thoughts on Donald Trump?
I can't talk politics. I can just make nasty. I can even make nastier ones than that, but I'm not allowed. It worries me, to tell you the truth. It frightens me that people are so happy to hate. It's not a very nice feeling. It's not a nice feeling. Having seen what can happen and what is going on in the world today, it's not very pretty, no. But I do believe that the average American is very decent, and I don't think he's going to win, no matter what. If not, we can all go to Canada. And Canada will build a wall to keep us out. Any? Oh, it's my website. Somebody just made it for me, and that ring is actually, I think it's a Japanese sign of goodness and eternity. And I like the shape of it. I didn't want to put a star on it. I think that was a bit much, so that's what I used. I think it's pretty. And I like that. The red color is the red barn color. My barn is that color, so that's what it is. And I brought this just so that I don't just stand on an empty stage. I don't like to bring pictures and photographs because I prefer you to use your imagination about what I talk about. I think you guys have a much better imagination than some old photograph, a tattered old picture. I only show you the pictures I held up, Dita and my father, but I don't like to use media. I have this brooch on here. Can you see it? It's actually a dove. It's made of brass, and this was made by children in Somalia who lost limbs because of the bombs. And they take the shell casings and they make jewelry and they sell it so they can buy artificial limbs. I think it's wonderful. I wear it all the time. That's what I mean about things going on still. There's horrible things going on all over the world. Sorry?
I like your Crocs. Your shoes.
Oh, of course I have Crocs. Everybody has Crocs. Not only Crocs, but I have an iPhone too. and I use it a lot. And I'm accused of behaving like a teenager, and I think it's a compliment. Anyway, I think we're done. Oh, no, there's somebody else. Did you put your hand up? Or was there a hand, or were you waving? No, okay. Yes, go ahead. Can you stand up and holler? She is, and not only that, but she's at Yad Vashem in Israel, but I also, once a year, I thank her in public. In Keene, they have I hate to call it a celebration, they have a commemoration of Kristallnacht, which was the night of broken glass when they had this huge anti-Jewish demonstrations in Germany when they burned synagogues and wrecked everything. And they have about 800 people who come out for this, and they're not Jewish necessarily, but it's a commemoration, and I always speak about her, and I thank her in Hungarian, because maybe she's listening. But then I thought I could say anything, because nobody knows Hungarian. I could say, how's the cabbage today, you know? No, but I do think about her a lot, and I'm very grateful to her for very obvious reasons. Anyone else? Yes.
It says author. Have you written any books?
Yes, I have. I've written an adult book, and I'm working on a children's book because I have to tone it down for kids, you know. I have. It took me a while, but, you know, it took me a while to process everything. I'm glad I lived as long as I did, because when I was 50, I was a totally different person. And the last, I would say, 15 years have been very good for me, because believe it or not, I grew, I evolved. Not only this way, but I evolved. You know, people ask me, having been hungry, how does it affect you every day? I said, well, I eat the leftovers, as you can see. You know, it does affect you. I don't throw out food. I have a horror of throwing out food. And I have a pantry that could feed the Russian army, just in case. Anyone else? Yes? Yes, we went to see her because we then emigrated to Israel when I was about 11, and we went out to see her, and it was a very sad occasion because by this time she wasn't well, and oh, it was so sad. She was such a hero, a real hero. And you know, these are the unsung heroes. No education, nothing, just a big heart. But you know, I think the only thing we can do against hatred is education, because the more you know, the less you hate, and the less you fear. And you know, hatred comes from fear. You fear the other. Oh, he doesn't look like me, he doesn't eat like me, he eats funny food, it smells different. Let's hate him, or I'm afraid of him, you know. Education. And I can see that you are a very diverse community here, so I don't think you have that problem here. And I thank you all very much for being a wonderful audience.